Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of features and articles from the Monday, December 15th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Actually, I was not able to read yesterday, so instead of reading old news, what I'll do today is read as many of the opinion pieces as I can because they are still current. So we'll start with David French. And the article is called, What Happens If You Refuse to Recognize That We Are in a Death Spiral? A strange thing happened to me a few years ago. I was eating dinner with my family when I got a message from a friend that there was a Clubhouse discussion happening about me. Clubhouse is a social media app that enjoyed a brief period of prominence during the pandemic. It allows people to host online conversations, and I've described it before as a cross between a conference call and a panel discussion. A person would create a virtual room, designate panelists who were permitted to speak, and then others could listen. That night, someone had created a room called David French, ba- based or cringe. In the language of the new right, based is a high compliment. It describes someone who doesn't just stick to his convictions, he doubles down regardless of social convention. In practice, it usually means that the more extreme you become, the more based you are. Cringe, on the other hand, is self-explanatory. No one wants to be cringe. I made an impulsive decision to join the room to hear the verdict, and I hoped to offer a word or two in my defense. Was I based or cringe? According to the people in the room, I was not just cringe, but supremely cringe. As I joined in, a panelist was mid-rant about my many, many deficiencies as a writer and as a person. But I decided to stay and talk, and for the next 3 hours I was bombarded with questions. The people in the room were mainly young members of the New Right, many of whom seemed to be less than half my age, MAGA to varying degrees, and they nursed deep grievances against me and any other conservative who resisted the ascension of Trump. The conversation was enlightening. While we talked about a number of issues, one theme was dominant. I refused to recognize that America was in a death spiral. The country was in a crisis, and I needed to open my eyes, steel my spine, and take the necessary, sometimes authoritarian steps to pull it from the brink. The core of their complaint was embodied by a quote from a novelist named G. Michael Hopf, who wrote in his book Those Who Remain, "Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times." In this telling, the strong men of the American past had created a glorious and powerful nation. Our peace and prosperity had spawned a weak and feckless generation that had squandered America's strength and cultural identity, and now it was time for hard men to arise to reclaim what was lost. This view of America's glorious past is indispensable to understanding MAGA's appeal and the extremism of MAGA youth. After all, the slogan, Make America Great Again, implies the loss of greatness. This sense of loss provides the intellectual and, crucially, emotional foundation of the right's authoritarian turn. It's hard to overstate how much the new right idealizes America's past. Online spaces are full of memes and images, for example, of families from the 1950s in idyllic settings, often with the caption, "This is what they took from you." The memes don't define who they are, but I quickly learned in the Clubhouse conversation that they very much included me. My support for free speech, for example, opened the door for depravity, and my defense of due process hindered the rough justice necessary to reclaim America. The new right contrasts its vision of a glorious past with a miserable present. This month, Matt Walsh, a popular right-wing podcaster with millions of social media followers, wrote, "It's an empirical fact that basically everything in our day-to-day lives has gotten worse over the years. The quality of everything, food, clothing, entertainment, air travel, roads, traffic, infrastructure, housing, etc., has declined in observable ways. This is, incidentally, where MAGA meets MAHA, Make America Healthy Again. Parts of MAHA are rooted in the conviction that American healthcare is fundamentally broken to the point of being dangerous. That's the root belief held by 31% of Republicans and Republican-leaning Americans that vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases they're designed to prevent. Walsh's statement, however, is the opposite of an empirical fact. In reality, it's empirically wrong on many, many counts. Americans live longer, enjoy higher median wages, live in larger and more luxurious homes, and enjoy more civil liberties and greater access to justice than even in the recent past. The starter homes of the 1950s, tiny places that often lacked central air and other modern utilities, would be considered poverty-level accommodations now. Violent crime is much lower than in decades past. The divorce rate has decreased from its high in the early 1980s, and the abortion rate, despite recent increases, is far below its early 1980s peaks. But even as I type these words, I realize their inadequacy. You cannot fact check a person out of a feeling, and without question, the people I talked to felt, deep in their bones, that something had gone fundamentally wrong in the United States and in their lives. And a dry recitation of contrary facts not only did nothing to assuage this feeling of fear and loss, it was positively enraging. Cringe, in a word. To use an example wielded against me time and again, how can you possibly say that America is better than it's been when drag queens are reading to kids in public libraries? To that I say, as my friend Kevin Williamson put it in a recent piece addressing the New Rights nostalgia, more drag queens, sure, but fewer slaves. The moral trajectory of Western civilization is not entirely in the direction of failure, you know. One disadvantage of your teenage and early adult years is that you tend to experience adversity without perspective. It's hard to place your own experience in a larger context when you haven't yet experienced that context. And that's exactly where we, the older generations, have failed. When I see young people radicalizing on the left and right, including through their greater tolerance for political violence, I see the fruit of our own intolerance and polarization. Consider this. In 2014, 1 year before Trump began his first presidential campaign, a Pew Research Center poll found that 82% of Republicans viewed the Democratic Party unfavorably or very unfavorably. The same poll found that 79% of Democrats had unfavorable or very unfavorable views of the Republican Party. Ominously, the percentage of Republicans and Democrats who viewed the opposing party very unfavorably had more than doubled in the previous 20 years. Animosity breeds hyperbole, and vice versa. I know that politics ain't beanbag, but we've all seen a steady escalation in political rhetoric. Every election is the most important of our lifetime. The fate of the nation hinges on every trip to the ballot box. Why does the young right think they stole the glorious past? Well, because that's the effect of teaching them that the other side makes everything worse. I can think of times when I lost perspective, when my words went too far. Partisanship was corrosive to my soul. Now, combine that hyperbole with smartphones and social media, and you've got a recipe for a non-stop sense of alarm. I can open my Twitter feed and see video after video of outrageous conduct, and no amount of telling myself that these are isolated incidents in a nation of over 340 million people can blunt their emotional impact. Even worse, parents and kids learn together to use their phones. We all experience these new technologies at the same time, and we often behave no better than our teenage sons and daughters. Our kids were taking notes as social media broke our brains and hardened our hearts. We made them vulnerable to charlatans, conspiracists, and conflict entrepreneurs because we proved to be vulnerable to others like them. Now this false sense of emergency is creating a real crisis. In 2016, the writer Michael Anton, who later worked for both the Trump administrations, wrote under a pseudonym an essay that soon became notorious and famous called the Flight 93 Election. He acknowledged that voting for Trump was a risk, but he argued electing Hillary Clinton would result in certain national disaster. There was only one option: charge the cockpit or die. But what happens, as I've argued before, if you charge the cockpit, incapacitate the pilot, take the controls, and realize the plane wasn't being hijacked, it was only experiencing turbulence? Well, then you're now flying a plane you don't know how to fly, and you've created your own emergency. As a Cold War kid, I grew up in tense times. The threat of open war with the Soviet Union and possible nuclear extinction haunted our daily lives. In the midst of crises and controversies, I took my emotional cues from my parents and from the adults around me in my small Kentucky hometown. They were never Pollyannas. How could you be? But they also never panicked. I definitely experienced anxiety, but they provided the context so that I could understand that we'd endured similar crises and survived before. The times were dangerous, but there was also more stability than I could perceive. The result is that I learned to approach the problems of the moment with determination, not despair. Problems are real, but hope endures. If I were to have that clubhouse conversation again, I think I'd start it differently. Rather than walking in and offering a polite challenge to debate, I'd start with an apology. I'm sorry that we turned against our own friends and neighbors and allowed political animosity to corrupt our hearts. I'm sorry that you grew up awash in images and rhetoric that we couldn't handle ourselves. I'm sorry that you were told that the fate of the nation, even of Christianity itself, hangs in the balance on every single election. I know the group I was talking to would find this cringe, but I'll say it anyway. What I am sorriest about is that we taught you to despair. And here's a guest essay by Greg Grandin, a professor of history at Yale, and it's called Trump's Dated Strategy is Putting Us on a Path to World War III. One wonders what goes on in the minds of the architects of President Trump's foreign policy. It seems as if they have all taken time to study the classic history books on the causes of the world wars, Margaret Macmillan's War That Ended Peace, or E.H. Carr's The 20 Years Crisis, and then said to themselves, that's exactly where we want to take the world. Trump, both in his first term and now during the first 11 months of his second, has made clear that the bipartisan post-Cold War consensus by which the U.S. oversaw an economically integrated world order governed by common laws regulating property relations, trade, and conflict, has outlived its usefulness. In its place, the White House offers a vision of the world carved up into garrison spheres of competing influence. This month, the White House issued its National Security Strategy Report, which sought to codify this transition. The report hits all the notes associated with aggrieved America First nationalism. It denounces globalism, free trade, and foreign aid, rejects nation building, and calls on NATO members to spend a greater portion of their GDP on defense spending. The U.S., the report warns, will no longer shoulder forever global burdens that have no direct connection to its own national interest. The heart of the report is a pledge to reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence. In the past, militarists invoked the Monroe Doctrine largely out of habit, a recitation of a well-worn catchphrase. Here, though, it plays a more substantive role in defining what an America First future world order might look like. For the uninitiated, the Monroe Doctrine is neither treaty nor law. It began life as a simple statement issued by President James Monroe in 1823, recognizing the independence of Spanish-American republics and warning Europe that the Western Hemisphere was off limits for future colonization. You're listening to a reading of articles from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. President James K. Polk in 1845 was among the first to elevate the statement into writ, invoking Mr. Monroe's doctrine in his push to take California from Mexico before the British. Polk would again cite Monroe when he annexed Texas. Subsequent presidents used the doctrine as an open police warrant, authorizing serial military occupations and U.S.-backed coups. By the late 19th century, Latin Americans had a new word to describe U.S. interventionism, Monroeismo. That the Trump administration would turn to this old diplomatic shibboleth to define its foreign policy philosophy makes sense. As the world order breaks into competing spheres of influence, each regional power needs to get its hinterlands under control. Moscow and the former Soviet republics, among other places, Beijing in the South China Sea, and beyond, and the United States and Latin America. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, said recently, if you're focused on America and America first, you start with your own hemisphere. And the Trump administration has, presiding in the last few months over a frenzy of activity, not just executing speedboat operatives alleged to be drug smugglers, but also meddling in the internal politics of Brazil, Argentina, and Honduras, issuing scattershot threats against Colombia and Mexico, menacing Cuba and Nicaragua, increasing its influence over the Panama Canal, and seizing an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. The Pentagon is also carrying out a military buildup in the Caribbean that is all but unprecedented in its scale and concentration of firepower, seemingly aimed at effecting regime change in Venezuela. America First nationalists have long been the staunchest defenders of the Monroe Doctrine. After World War I, nationalists used it to push back against Woodrow Wilson's proposed League of Nations. Join the League, Henry Cabot Lodge, the powerful Republican chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, warned, and the Monroe Doctrine disappears, and with it, national sovereignty. Lodge, who identified as an American firster, said he refused to swear allegiance to the League's mongrel flag. Senators put forward a resolution ensuring that nothing in the League's mandate would prevent the U.S. from using military force in Latin America, and that the Monroe Doctrine would remain wholly outside the jurisdiction of the said League of Nations. Bowing to pressure, Wilson tried to neutralize opposition by inserting a clause into the League's charter reaffirming the validity of the Monroe Doctrine. For naught, the Senate still voted against joining. At this point, the United States lost its proprietary claim on the phrase. After Japan's imperial army invaded Manchuria in 1931, Tokyo declared its own Monroe Doctrine. Britain invoked a British Monroe Doctrine to justify the continued existence of its empire, and Adolf Hitler responded to FDR's demand that he respect the sovereignty of Germany's neighbors by pointing the U.S. president to his nation's own Monroe Doctrine. We Germans have exactly the same doctrine for Europe, or at least for the region and the interests of the greater German Reich. As the world marched into a second global war, many of its belligerents did so, citing the Monroe Doctrine. Trump's renewal of the Monroe Doctrine comes at a similarly precarious moment in world politics. His national security strategy identifies Latin America not, as Monroe did in his 1823 statement, as part of a common community of New World nations, but as a theater of global rivalry, a place to extract resources, secure commodity chains, establish bulwarks of national security, fight the drug war, limit Chinese influence, and end migration. The National Security Strategy Report insists that the United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, able to act where and when we need to secure U.S. interests. Mr. Trump's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine simply means that Latin America is to be locked down, and Latin Americans locked out. Washington has no intention of withdrawing from its position of global primacy. In place of the now defunct liberal international order, the White House is implicitly globalizing the Monroe Doctrine, claiming for the U.S. the right to unilaterally respond to perceived threats not just within its own hemisphere, but anywhere on Earth, excluding China. That claim is not new. It was the centerpiece of the global war on terror. But to insist on it with no accountability, under no outside jurisdictions, free of multilateral entailments and obligations, means that the U.S. intends to deal with the rest of the world as it deals with Latin America, to seize, sanction, and kill with impunity. In 1919, Ismael Montes, a Bolivian diplomat, lamented the fact that the treaty that formally ended World War I by validating a bellicose version of the Monroe Doctrine made future conflict inevitable. The peace is not yet signed, Montes said, and one can already see the seeds of a new war. Today, the Trump administration is sowing the same seeds. Its ideal of a world organized around a multi-front balance of power, with the U.S. pushing against China, pushing against Russia, sowing division in Europe, threatening Latin America with all countries everywhere angling for advantage, means there will most likely be more confrontation, more brinkmanship, more war. We must be prepared, as NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently said, for the scale of war our parents and great-grandparents endured. And it says guest essay, Donald Trump's Cowboy Diplomacy. This is by Jonathan Geyer, a writer on foreign policy. It was on an October flight from the Middle East to Miami that everything envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, decided it was time to turn to Ukraine. Through sheer chutzpah, the duo had just clinched an unlikely ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas just after the war's second anniversary. Could the same tactic work on another seemingly intractable conflict? Soon after the flight, Russian and Ukrainian diplomats were shuttling to Florida, where Mr. Witkoff lives. The president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get to the deal, Witkoff told a Russian aide in a leaked recording of their phone call. Within weeks, he and Mr. Kushner, just as they did with the Gaza ceasefire deal, put together a list of conditions they wanted the Russians and Ukrainians to sign on to. This time it didn't work. Witkoff's proposed deal angered the Ukrainians and alienated Europeans, who say it highly favors Russia. And Putin of Russia is already pushing to get even more out of the Americans. The peace deal President Trump said he could deliver 24 hours into his second presidency, then again by Thanksgiving, remains out of his grasp. The president's men may yet stumble onto a path to progress in a war that has been stuck in a stalemate for years. After all, in a few short months, Witkoff, a New York landlord whose prior foreign policy bona fides included a string of lucrative luxury real estate deals and the distinction of being Trump's golfing partner, has notched diplomatic successes that eluded President Biden's most experienced envoys. The administration's critics say the deals in Ukraine and Gaza are half-baked, that they're built on the back of diplomatic work done by the Biden team, that they endanger our allies and long-term national security interests. All of that may be true, but the foreign policy establishment should not write off the Trump approach. Sometimes Trump's unconventional foreign policy, let's call it cowboy diplomacy, just works. The traditional methods of American foreign policy established after World War II as contemporary institutions of statecraft and national security took shape are painstaking and methodical. The bureaucratic interagency process of sign-offs between offices and departments often left little room for principal American diplomats to act. Their job was to arrive at the end of a long process of talks and negotiations to seal the deal. By contrast, Trump's cowboy diplomats are out front from the beginning. They speak bluntly. They seize opportunities and work out the details later. The strategy has yielded impressive results. In the Middle East, Trump has shattered long-standing taboos. He dispatched envoys to engage with Hamas, a designated foreign terrorist organization, and lifted sanctions on Syria after the fall of the dictator Bashar al-Assad, and last month welcomed its interim president, a former commander of a rebel group allied with al-Qaeda, to the White House. Trump's envoys have accomplished tricky prisoner exchanges with Russia and made progress in enduring conflicts between Azerbaijan and Armenia and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. In typical Trump hyperbole, the administration has repeatedly claimed the president has ended 8 wars in just 8 months. Those numbers don't add up. But through conversations with more than a dozen current and former Trump and Biden appointees and career diplomats, I've learned that many seasoned foreign policy experts find a certain utility in Trump's approach. The practitioners I spoke to said there are real benefits of operating outside of the strictures of diplomatic precedent, even if there are also serious risks of inexperienced envoys running policy. The problem, they said, is that after the evisceration of the State Department, there aren't enough experienced professionals to finish the job after Trump's envoys get back on their jets and go home. Cowboy diplomacy can be highly effective for the opening salvo, but if the experts aren't around to step in to finalize the details, these flashy deals may soon fall to pieces. A quick look at Trump's foreign policy shop shows what a departure his team is from Biden world, where many appointees hailed from the usual handful of think tanks and law schools, or were former senior administration officials under President Obama. The appointees in Trump's second term, as in his first, seem to share proximity to the president via marriage or business dealings as their primary qualification. Massad Boulos, the father-in-law of the president's daughter Tiffany, is a small-time truck salesman who, without having been confirmed by the Senate, effectively now runs Africa policy in the State Department. Mr. Kushner lacks a formal portfolio in this administration, but has been orchestrating Middle East policy alongside Mr. Witkoff. His father, Charles Kushner, is the U.S. ambassador to France and Monaco. Tom Barrack, a Lebanese-American investor close to Trump who was indicted and later acquitted of being a foreign agent of the United Arab Emirates, serves as the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. He has leveraged the position into a much bigger Middle East portfolio, including a post-Assad Syria. Each of these men's ability to pick up the phone and speak to Trump rather than go through a laborious interagency process gives them direct access to presidential power. That in itself is not new. Foreign Service officers say that ambassadors who are political appointees, in contrast to the ambassadors who rise through the ranks over decades of training and public service, have long had the ability to give their embassy more clout, and Trump is hardly the first president to rely on less experienced confidants. There's a long tradition of American presidents having outsider friends who they trust far more than they do the people in their system, said Alexander Gray, the chief of staff of the National Security Council in Trump's first term. Having that outsider with close presidential trust can be a very effective way to break log jams. But Trump's envoys have far-reaching power relative to their inexperience. Mr. Boulos, officially a senior State Department advisor, has been received by multiple heads of state, despite the fact that he neither is in the cabinet nor has special envoy in his title. He helped broker a peace deal between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. This month, they signed the agreement at the recently rebranded Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace. The treaty has not entirely shifted the reality on the ground, but it was a significant step for two countries that have been at war for 3 decades. If you're trying to negotiate with a head of state and with a head of intelligence in Congo, they want to know that you have the president's ears, said a senior Biden diplomat who worked on Africa policy. That's much more important to them than whether you've had 20 years of experience as a diplomat. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In February, Mr. Witkoff worked to get an American teacher named Mark Fogel released from Russian prison. Special envoys have leveraged the president's power to help secure the release of American detainees from Russia, Belarus, and Afghanistan. Over the course of his term, Mr. Biden worked to free some 70 Americans held by foreign governments. Trump has already freed that many in the last year, yielding the kind of tough guy, telegenic diplomatic moments that the administration loves. Some of the cowboy diplomats employ a folksy bluntness that stands out in the otherwise staid foreign policy setting. In October, Mr. Witkoff had lobbied Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's extremist pro-settler national security minister, to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. We just can't play the victim all the time, said Mr. Witkoff, who lost his son to an overdose and likened his pain to the national trauma of October 7th. At some point, he said, you gotta let it go. He used a similar vein of strategic empathy with Hamas representative Khalil al-Hayya, whose son was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Qatar in September. After 2 years of nearly unrelenting warfare, Mr. Witkoff's personal first methods had helped secure a truce between Israel and Hamas. Conflicts of interest abound. The Witkoff family, through its virtual currency company World Liberty Financial, co-founded by Mr. Witkoff's sons, and in which the Trump family also has a sizable stake, landed a $2 billion crypto investment from a firm backed by the United Arab Emirates. While holding a large financial stake in the company, Mr. Witkoff advocated giving the Emirates access to high-tech chips. Tiffany Trump socialized with an oil billionaire who stands to profit from her father-in-law's statecraft. Jared Kushner's investment firm is largely financed by the same petrostates that would be involved in the potential reconstruction of Gaza: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. What people call conflicts of interest, Steve and I call experience and trusted relationships that we have throughout the world, said Mr. Kushner. The new envoy's lack of experience also makes them more prone to insult their host. See Mr. Barak's referring to Lebanese journalists as animalistic, for which he later apologized. Get played by savvy world leaders, see Mr. Witkoff's meeting with Putin with only a Kremlin interpreter, or simply be caught off guard. In a July meeting, the Tunisian president showed Mr. Boulos photographs of starving Palestinian children and chastised him. The official stood and listened, almost unresponsive. Amid the toughest diplomatic feats that lie ahead for Trump would be a breakthrough with Iran. In April, there was an opening. Mr. Witkoff shook hands with Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi in Oman and then met him a week later in Rome in a bid to renegotiate the nuclear deal that the president had abrogated in his first term. Mr. Witkoff had suggested a deal in which Iran could continue enriching some uranium as long as it didn't present a threat, in exchange for offering Tehran economic relief. He left Oman happy, according to a senior Iranian official. Then things got rocky. In May, Mr. Witkoff switched his tack. He said that Iran would have to agree to zero enrichment, perhaps as a result of criticism from more hawkish MAGA figures and right-wing media, who balked at allowing any enrichment. For the Iranians, that was a non-starter, a jab at Iran's national pride. The sudden change caused Mr. Witkoff to lose credibility with the Iranians. Then, days before Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Araghchi were due to meet again, Israel launched airstrikes against Iran. And Mr. Trump joined the attack, dropping bombs on 3 nuclear sites. Now, diplomacy with Iran is on hold. Not every deal is holding up. Intense fighting continued on the Congo-Rwanda border hours after Trump said he ended the war. A Trump-brokered ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia fell apart in November. Last week, Thailand conducted airstrikes on the Cambodian border. On Friday, Trump said both countries agreed to return to the terms of the original ceasefire. It will take concerted diplomacy to transform Trump's initial brief agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia into a lasting peace. Throughout the Gaza ceasefire, Israel has killed at least 360 Palestinians. In Ukraine, Russia has conducted some of its deadliest strikes since the war began, even as Trump's team negotiates. As quickly as these dramatic agreements were brokered, the risk for America and for the millions of people whose fate hangs in the balance is that they might collapse just as quickly. David Schenker, who served as one of Trump's top Middle East officials in his first term, says this style of foreign policy is in line with the ethos of the administration. There's not a whole lot of appreciation for expertise, he said. It's good to have a disruptive approach every now and then, but there's a cost. Nothing will be more high stakes than the deal-making between Russia and Ukraine. The MAGA coalition that elected Trump views him as a peacemaker and doesn't want to continue paying for this war. Aspects of the peace plan under consideration today lay out difficult truths, including that Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories of Crimea and the Donbass are likely to stay that way. That reflects the reality on the ground and the perspective of many Americans in a clearer way than any other presidential statement to date. Almost 75% of Republicans want NATO member countries to push for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. Whether Trump can strong-arm Ukraine toward a breakthrough will be the ultimate test of his unorthodoxy. Even if a deal does get done, it will be the true experts who work out the fine print and make sure it lasts. Absent follow-through, the most grandiose efforts will not be enough to end the carnage. Getting two sides to a yes is only part one. But who will be there to finish the job? The everyday work of career officials has dramatically diminished. The State Department's annual human rights reports have been pared down to the point of futility. The staffing level of the National Security Council has been reduced so significantly that it has led to open dysfunction. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, now also the acting National Security Advisor, has fired hundreds of State Department experts and members of the senior diplomatic corps. Trump's cowboy diplomats, with their jets and ostentatious deal-making, may end up helping him stop the biggest wars he inherited. If his team manages to freeze in place the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, even if they are left largely unresolved, that would still be more than his predecessor was able to accomplish. But if peace is built on hollow agreements, on single-spaced sheets of paper with bullet points waved on the White House lawn, peace may not last very long. And one more guest essay. This one is called The Humanity Amid the Horror at Bondi Beach by Sharon Bruce. There is a particular horror in violent attacks on holy days and in holy places. This is terror in its purest form, not only rendering a people fearful to express their faith, but also causing them to forever associate those sacred days with loss and sorrow. The holiday of Simchat Torah, the Jewish celebration of the joyful embrace of Torah, will be permanently tied to images of death and destruction after the attacks of October 7th, 2023. And now, just over 2 years later, another Jewish holiday has been linked with terror. Hanukkah, the miracle of the persistence of light in dark times, as Jews gathered to celebrate on a beach in Sydney, Australia. A crowd of children, parents, and elders were gunned down without mercy. I'm tired of looking for the silver lining after such tragedies. I no longer want to hear after a mass shooting of the remarkable ways a community came together. I don't want platitudes and pieties. I want justice. I want accountability for the rhetoric and the policies, and in our own country, the obscenely easy access to weapons of war that endanger us all. I don't want to celebrate resilience. I want to see reform. But as a spiritual matter, I urgently need the silver lining. I need the hints of humanity that remind us that what is not is what that let me do that again. I need the hints of humanity that remind us that what is not what must be. The quiet insistence that there is more light than darkness in this world, that tenderness and love can prevail over even the most virulent hatred. Give me the counterfactual that makes it impossible to fall into despair, that will keep me from slipping into the self-defeating certainty of our impending doom. A great 20th century Hasidic rabbi, Shalom Noach Berezovsky, known as the Netivot Shalom, argues that all the miracles and wonders that have occurred for the Jewish people over the generations have been drawn forth through their refusal to accept their circumstances. This is what he calls Kusta de Chiyuta, the small holy spark of vitality that contains the light of hope and possibility for a better future. After Sydney, after witnessing the raging gunmen, allegedly a father and son, united in their animus toward my people, after reading of the Holocaust survivor who died protecting his wife, and the 10-year-old girl, and a rabbi, and so many more, after all of this, I need that spark of vitality. I need the reminder, small as it may be, that we must not succumb to the darkness. And here it is. that hint of humanity, that spark of vitality. I see it in Ahmad El Ahmed, the fruit vendor who risked his life to tackle one of the gunmen, no doubt saving lives. And there are more. I see that spark of vitality in the vibrancy of the worldwide Jewish community that immediately rallied in solidarity, reminding us that when one limb is struck, the whole body is unwell. As far apart as we might be, geographically, politically, religiously, we are family. I see that spark of vitality in how immediately and without reservation the Grand Mufti of Australia condemned in the strongest and most unequivocal terms the terrorist attack targeting Australian Jews. I see that spark of vitality in all those good people around the world who reached out with concern to their Jewish neighbors, colleagues, and friends. Last week, videos were released of 6 of the hostages abducted from the Nova Festival and the border kibbutzim on October 7th. These 6 were held deep beneath the earth in Gaza for nearly a year before they were executed by their Hamas captors in August 2024. In the videos, the hostages say Hanukkah blessings and light candles. Together they sing Ma'oz Tzur, often translated as Rock of Ages, the song that accompanies Hanukkah candle lighting, a testament to Jewish survival through the ages and the strength found in our faith in God. The hostages make one another laugh as someone asks, "Where are the sufganiyot, the Hanukkah donuts?" Then Hirsch Goldberg Polin, 23 years old, reminds the group of the famous photo of a Hanukkah, a Hanukkah menorah, on the windowsill in Kiel, Germany, taken in 1931 through open drapes, revealing in the background a swastika banner on the building across the street. It's a hint, a prayer, a symbol of eternal defiance. On the back of that photo, it is written Hanukkah 5692, Death to Judah. So the flag says Judah will live forever, so the light answers. When I light the Hanukkah candles this year, I will think of 6 Jews holding one another many feet beneath the shattered earth of Gaza, smiling and joking and singing quietly, even as they must have feared that they wouldn't make it out alive. And I will hold the image of that Hanukkah on the windowsill in Germany, a sign of defiance against the forces of darkness. And I will think of Ahmed El Ahmed and thank God for planting such a courageous and decent soul in this world. And I will remember that light is born in the midst of the deepest, most impenetrable darkness. That has always been true, and it's true today. And here's a somewhat different editorial. A gift that gets children reading. This is by the editorial board. The decline of literacy rates over the past decade is a national emergency. Fewer than a third of the nation's 4th graders had proficient reading scores last year, and the share is even lower among poor children. The causes are many, including ineffective teaching methods, misallocated spending, digital technology, and long COVID-19 school closures. As severe as the nation's literacy problem is, it is not intractable. Effective charity can help, especially when the Trump administration is unwisely dismantling the Department of Education. First Book, a New York Times Community Fund partner, makes sure low-income school districts have access to high-quality books. Teachers who used First Book reported that their students spent more time reading and their literacy scores improved. Consider Stevens Forest Elementary School in Columbia, Maryland. More than 50% of the school's 330 students come from low-income households. Many are part of a Latin American immigrant community and are the first in their families to be learning English. Yet because the school is in an affluent county, its challenges are sometimes overlooked. In 2023, her first year as the assistant principal at Stevens Forest, Casey Schumann received $500 from the New York Times Communities Fund to buy books on the First Book website. The site provides free or reduced cost books to educators working with low-income students. She bought books intended to excite reluctant readers. One example, Butt or Face, a picture book that teaches children about animals by having readers guess which part of an animal's body they're looking at. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Teachers use First Book funding to build their classroom libraries and host book talks to drum up enthusiasm. Dr. Schumann said she's seen students cheer and run to open the boxes of books delivered to their classroom. First Book provides books tailored to the roughly one-fifth of Stevens Forest students who are English language learners. One student from an immigrant family is obsessed with soccer, and she wears a Lionel Messi jersey to school every day. So Dr. Schumann ordered 2 versions of a book about him on a First Book's website, one in English for the student to read in the classroom, and one in Spanish for her to read to the family at home. Both copies have become well worn. Many students take books home to keep reading outside the classroom. Often these are the first books that they've ever called their own. One of Dr. Schumann's former students, who lives in a multifamily home, even created her own lending library of First Book titles on her shelf in a closet. She allows family members to check out books and keeps records. Early access to high-quality books can transform lives, improve educational outcomes, and help create the next generation of curious and informed citizens. To make a meaningful investment in American education, we encourage you to consider donating to First Books through the New York Times Communities Fund. And I didn't mean to make a pitch for a charity, but actually this sounds like a good one, so it's a good time to give to charities. And with that, I will conclude today's reading. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm sorry I didn't get to the news yesterday, but these were, I think, good editorials. And I look forward to speaking with you next week. Stay warm and be safe. Thank you for listening. This is Ted with the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service.